Thank you. Mr. President, Moody's Investors Service is one of America's credit rating agencies. It's not an environmental organization. It doesn't have any activity in the debate over climate change. That's not what it does. What Moody's does is to analyze the ability of companies and government agencies that issue debt to meet those debt obligations. Now, these Moody's ratings matter because they determine the interest rates that states and counties and municipalities and companies must pay. There was some interesting news last week. Moody's declared that it is time for cities, counties, and states along our coasts, Alaska being an example of a state with a lot of coast, to wake up to the growing risk of climate change. Moody's has adopted credit indicators, to quote them, to assess the exposure and overall susceptibility of U.S. states to the physical effects of climate change. What the managing director said is this: what we want people to realize is if you're exposed, we know that. We're going to ask questions about what you're doing to mitigate that exposure. Now, Moody's looked particularly at coasts and at the share of a state's economic activity generated by its coasts and coastal communities, the amount of homes built on floodplains, and the risk of extreme weather damage in that state or community as a share of the economy. That's taken into your credit ratings, Moody's said, end quote. It makes sense, obviously. Communities that face rising seas, that face heavier storms, that face increased flood damage will bear greater costs of mitigation and repair, and if property values drop as a result, so does revenue. Moody's realizes that investors need to take that information into account in analyzing bonds. So it's going into the Moody's ratings. Think about that. The truth of climate science has gone beyond the warnings of scientists, which we ought to have heeded a long time ago. You have outstanding scientists at the University of Alaska who are studying ocean acidification, sea level changes, all of that. And we probably would have listened to those scientists but for the influence of the fossil fuel industry here. The truth of climate science has gone beyond the warnings of government agencies, national laboratories, and our military services, warnings which have been there for a long time and which we also ought to have heeded and probably would have but for the political influence of the fossil fuel industry. It's even gone beyond the warnings of our coastal states and communities and the coastal regulators, even beyond the warnings of the insurance and reinsurance industries, all of which we have refused to heed to placate the fossil fuel lobby. But now, the financial referees who score credit risk are baking climate change risks into the assessment of coastal communities' creditworthiness. Moody's is not going to assess this risk just in blue states. Coastal communities in every corner of the country, in blue states and red states alike, are facing climate change risk to their citizens and their economies. Let's take a look at North Carolina. I visited North Carolina in 2014 to see the effects of climate change along our southeast coast. The problems I saw there bore a striking resemblance to what's happening in our shorefront towns in Rhode Island. And the coastal folks that I met in North Carolina were every bit as concerned as coastal Rhode Islanders. I visited the Marine Science Facility at Pivers Island, where scientists from Duke University, University of North Carolina State, East Carolina State, and NOAA are all studying sea level rise and other effects of climate change. I met with the North Carolina Coastal Federation at their Coastal Education Center in Wilmington, where a bipartisan group was united in concern over the exposure of their coastal communities to rising seas and fiercer storms. And I flew out over the Outer Banks to where sea level rise is slowly swallowing and relocating them. The Outer Banks were formed millennia ago by the interaction of seas and sand. They are dynamic barriers that move with tides and storms. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, I'll quote them, "The Outer Banks, particularly the ocean side, have always been hazardous places for man," end quote. Nevertheless, they have become permanent home to over 30,000 people, and they attract over $1 billion in tourist spending into that county. According to a recent comprehensive article by Inside Climate News and The Weather Channel, one beach near East Seagull Drive in Nags Head, quote, has been eroding at about 6 feet per year. 6 feet per year. Rapid erosion threatens storefront homes and brings the ocean ever closer to major roads and infrastructure. State engineers scramble to keep Outer Banks roads and bridges open and to rebuild them stronger and higher. This isn't just a North Carolina issue. This is a story familiar to many coastal communities. A Union of Concerned Scientists study reports sea level rise doubling the number of communities along the coast facing what the study calls chronic inundations and possible retreat in the next 20 years. GAO, which we depend on for a great many things here, recently reported that coastal areas face particularly high financial risks, hence the Moody's decision, and that annual coastal property losses from sea level rise and increased storms would run into the billions of dollars every year in the short run, reaching over $50 billion every year by late century. Every year, over $50 billion in loss to coastal properties if we don't pay attention. GAO referenced a report that estimated the total of $5 trillion in economic costs to coastal property from climate change through 2100. $5 trillion in economic cost to our coastal communities. That is a story that Rhode Islanders see coming at us as well. Our barrier beach communities like Matunic Beach and Green Hill in South Kingstown see rapid erosion. The top photo here from North Carolina shows one of the 2 remaining homes at East Seagull Drive in Nags Head, the site I talked about. You can see there's an exposed septic tank that all the sand has been washed off of, and you can see that there's limited beach left, and at high tide, that house is over water. On the bottom is a strikingly similar picture of houses in Green Hill, Rhode Island. This photo was taken after the April 2007 nor'easter that tore through New England. This family's septic tank is also exposed from the sand that's been removed all around it, and the pilings here are keeping the home above the water. By 2009, this home got repaired, but it had to be moved back from the seashore and up a dune bank. Now, you can only move back so far from rising seas before you start bumping into people's property behind you. My predecessor, Senator John Chafee, who was once the chairman of our Environment Public Works Committee, owned a family house in Matunic, Rhode Island, where I remember swimming as a young man. The Chafee house is now completely gone, lost to rising seas. Rhode Island's coast took a real lashing in 2012's Superstorm Sandy. These images are from Matunic, where Sandy's storm surge wiped away beaches and exposed shorefront houses to the raw power of the sea. The historic Browning cottages up here were family homes for generations. 2 of those historic homes had to be demolished. The third could be relocated inland. You can see from these shoreline maps the retreat of the shore to sea level rise and what it's done to these beachfront communities. Here in Nag's Head, these little red squares are all where houses used to be, that the sea moved in on. They couldn't move backwards. They had to be demolished and moved away. Only 2 remain, these 2. As you can see by the old shorelines, not that long ago, coastal homes had yards of beach in front of them that is now lost. And storms, as well as sea level rise, can change all that. If you look at this Rhode Island map, you can see the steady loss of beach along this shore, but it tells 2 stories. Not only is it the story of the gradual loss of beach to rising seas, but it's also the story of the sudden devastation that a storm can wreak. This red line is how far the beach got pushed back in the hurricane of 1938. One big storm just scoured that beach clean. Now we're back behind that, and here's the 2014 line in blue. If you look at this site on Google right now, you can see that it's gone even further back, and along Matunic, the coastline, this is an establishment called the Ocean Mist. You can have a great time in the Ocean Mist. It is a great place. And not very long ago, you could walk out the front of the Ocean Mist and down onto the beach, and you could walk dozens of yards across beach where people played volleyball and took the sun and hung out before you got to the sea. This is the Ocean Mist today. It has had to be propped up on pilings as the sea comes underneath it. Now, North Carolina and the federal government are having to spend millions of dollars replenishing the Outer Banks beaches. The state now has to re-nourish more than 100 miles of beach compared to just a dozen miles it worried about a few decades ago. Western Carolina University has tallied up more than $300 million spent by the state on beach nourishment from 2007 to 2016. Another $64 million is expected to be spent by local governments near Nag's Head this year, and $48 million more in 2018. Nationwide, we spent about $3.1 billion on beach nourishment. EcoRI reports that Rhode Island lost around 90,000 cubic yards of beach sand just from Superstorm Sandy. So over $3 million of federal funding had to be used to help rebuild those Matunic beaches after the storm. But beach nourishment, seawalls, bulkheads, rock armaments, you name it, they are all temporary stopgaps that must eventually yield to rising seas. And as this happens, there will be a constant drain out of local treasuries as communities have to spend more and more to keep up with the rising seas. And there will be a gradual loss of revenue into local treasuries as valuable oceanfront properties that pay local property taxes are lost. That is why Moody's is starting to score this issue in coastal communities. Now, one solution that coastal communities can come up with is to ignore this. In 2010, North Carolina's Resource Commission Science Panel on Coastal Hazards recommended that a sea level rise of 1 meter, 39 inches, be adopted as the amount of anticipated rise by 2100. That was back in 2010. Since then, data compiled and analyzed by NOAA shows that that number was way too low, that the worst case potential for sea level rise on those shores is about twice that, 2 meters of sea level rise. Here's what the Raleigh News and Observer reported. The state, quote, adopted a 30-year forecast that figures the rise at 8 inches, end quote. The odds of that becoming true are virtually nil. Just ask Moody's how credible that estimate is in face of the evidence. Moody's is going to be going in and looking at this stuff, and they're not going to buy phony baloney assertions that you're only going to see 8 inches of sea level rise when NOAA is predicting 2 meters. And you're going to be rated on not being ready because you're not responding to the obvious science. Climate denial works in politics because of the massive political influence of the fossil fuel industry. But it really is not going to matter to Moody's assessors. In Rhode Island, our Coastal Resources Management Council is now planning for a worst-case scenario of 9 to 12 vertical feet of sea level rise along our shores by the end of the century. 9 to 12 vertical feet. Colleagues may want me to laugh that off and say, nope, too inconvenient to talk about that. Really ticks off our fossil fuel friends. I will never, never ignore this. I can't ignore this, and we as a body should not ignore this. No amount of beach nourishment will protect Rhode Island from that. At 10 feet, we will lose 36 square miles of extremely valuable shorefront land, people's homes, people's businesses, the marinas and fishing piers that people depend on. 36 square miles lost because we can't say no to the fossil fuel industry around here. We must act on climate change now to give coastal states any chance to avoid these worst-case scenarios. And we have to help coastal communities plan for the changes we can't avoid. A recent report from Texas A&M and Rice University researchers highlights what they called, get this, the growing disconnect between the 100-year FEMA floodplain and the location of actual flood losses. And again, the growing consensus over the inability of the FEMA-derived floodplains to capture actual loss. On average, about a quarter of insured flood losses occur outside the mapped floodplains. And in some cases, more than 50% of flood losses occur outside of what the maps said would be flooded areas. With bad mapping, we are leaving local communities at a terrible handicap. So back to that GAO report, quantifying those coastal risks. It notes, quote, given the potential magnitude of climate change and the lead time needed to adapt, preparing for these impacts now may reduce the need for more costly steps in the decades to come. But it also points out, and I'll quote them here, the federal government does not have government-wide strategic planning efforts in place to manage what it called significant climate risks before they become federal fiscal exposures. The federal government does not have government-wide strategic planning efforts in place. Madam President, we have to give local communities better support. Bad maps and no planning is not support. Our coastal homes, our coastal economies, and our coastal heritage are all at stake, and bad maps and no planning aren't meeting those responsibilities. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.